Hey guys, tonight we drift into a story that feels like a fever dream stitched out of stone ruins, flickering torches, and secrets no one ever meant you to hear. Imagine yourself standing in the crumbling bones of a fortress, the walls cracked and sagging, moss gripping the stones like stubborn memories. The night air tastes like dust and iron, and somewhere a barn owl screeches, reminding you that you probably won't survive this if the ghosts of the Templars have anything to say about it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening right now, drop your location and your local time in the comments. Let us see just how far these whispers stretch across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The ground crunches under your boots as you wander through what's left of a Templar stronghold, somewhere forgotten by modern maps. Stones lean like old men dozing, mortars eroded by centuries of wind and rain. You trace a finger along one, surprised by the faint groove of a cross still carved into the rock. For a moment, you can almost hear chanting rising from the chapel that once stood here, monks in white mantles bearing the red cross, their voices echoing in rhythm with drums of war. This was their world, the 12th and 13th centuries, a time when knights were both warriors and monks, half saints and half swordsmen. You picture them, armored figures riding into battle for Christendom while swearing vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. It sounds contradictory, doesn't it? Owning no personal wealth, but somehow managing to become one of the richest orders in Europe. Historians still argue whether that wealth came from clever banking or from some darker, more mysterious source unearthed beneath the Temple Mount. You kick at the dirt and find what looks like an old shard of pottery. Jagged and unimportant, but you can't help thinking, was it once used by one of those knights filled with water or wine? Maybe both, depending on how tough the week was. That's the funny thing about ruins. They look empty, but every stone and splinter is a stubborn little time capsule. And yet, the ruins whisper louder than they should. They murmur about something that isn't just treasure or relics, but blood. A bloodline living, breathing, walking among us, even now. Mainstream historians roll their eyes, dismissing it as legend. But you can almost imagine a strand of DNA, winding like ivy through the centuries, binding the Templars to something far older and stranger than simple knighthood. As you push deeper into the ruin, your steps echo in what might once have been the refectory, the dining hall. Long tables stood here, knights sitting shoulder to shoulder, chewing their austere meals. Bread, beans, maybe a little meat if luck held. Definitely no crocodile dung sunscreen like the Egyptians we joked about before. These guys had more pressing concerns, like staying alive in a desert that wanted them gone. Yet the air still seems to vibrate with their presence, like you've arrived too early for a feast that hasn't happened in 700 years. The mainstream fact here? These men were real. They fought in the crusades, established financial systems that prefigured modern banking, and left behind fortresses that still scar the landscape from Portugal to Jerusalem. The quirky tidbit: some accounts claim their rules even specified how many shirts a knight could own. Exactly 3, no more, no less. Imagine today's influencers trying to live off just 3 outfits, though. To be fair, some of them practically do. But here's where the whispers lean in. There are old stories that the Templars weren't only guarding relics. They may have been protecting a lineage, flesh and blood, rather than gold and jewels. Descendants tied, some claim, to Christ himself. Others scoff, saying it's all medieval gossip that spiraled into Don Brown novels. Still, as you stand in the chill ruin, the idea doesn't seem quite so laughable. Historians still argue whether the legends of a bloodline were propaganda invented by their enemies, or whether a kernel of truth hides beneath centuries of denial. You pause by what's left of an arched doorway. Beyond it, the ground dips into shadow, as if the earth itself swallowed the past whole. Did tunnels once run here? Secret passages? Vaults filled with relics? Or maybe just storerooms for salted fish and barrels of beer? Hard to say. But your gut insists the stones aren't finished talking. And maybe that's the real charm of ruins. They don't hand you answers. They dangle mysteries like bait. You can laugh them off, or you can follow them down into the dark. And tonight, you're definitely stepping into the dark. Your fingers trail over the last wall, rough and cold. You picture the hands that built it, the prayers whispered as mortar dried, the clink of swords against shields echoing in the distance. The Templars are gone, officially dissolved in 1312, hunted and burned. Yet here you stand, centuries later, and somehow they're still around, if only in the rumors, and maybe just maybe in the veins of the living. The salty winds of Iberia still cling to your cloak as you head north, across storm-tossed seas and into a land wrapped in mist. Scotland, its cliffs rise jagged against gray skies, its glens echo with the bleating of sheep, and its castles loom like stubborn old men refusing to bow to time. Here the story of the Templars takes on a darker, wilder, flavor half history, half legend, and entirely soaked in whiskey. The mainstream historical fact to anchor you, after the Order's dissolution. Scotland was one of the few places where papal decrees carried little weight. King Robert the Bruce, excommunicated at the time for defying Rome, had no interest in burning Templars at the stake just because the Pope said so. That gave fugitives a potential safe haven. Some chroniclers even suggest that exiled knights fought at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, charging across the field in their white mantles to tip the scales against the English. Whether true or not, it's a tale that's stuck like burrs in Scotland's long grass. The quirky tidbit? Local legends whisper that the Templars brought more than swords, they brought relics. Some point to Rosslyn Chapel, built centuries later, but filled with carvings that seem oddly Templar in design. Knights, angels, vines that look suspiciously like New World maize carved long before Columbus. Coincidence, or proof of hidden knowledge preserved in stone? Standing inside Rosslyn, you tilt your head at a column where a stone knight leans just a little too knowingly toward you. If statues could wink, this one would. Historians still argue whether the Templars ever truly settled here in numbers, or whether the stories of Bannockburn and Rosslyn are romantic fabrications born centuries later. But as you tramp through heather and mist, the ground feels thick with secrets. Every ruined abbey and moss-covered stone could be another breadcrumb in the trail of the Lost Order. And then there's the Bloodline, Scotland, with its tangled web of clans and half-hidden genealogies. It would have been the perfect place to bury a secret lineage. Imagine a Templar knight arriving under cover of night, his horse exhausted, his cloak torn. He finds shelter in a Highland castle where a local laird agrees to hide him. Weeks turn into months, months into years. The knight marries into the clan, his foreign cross gradually blending with Celtic knots. His children grow up not as knights but as Scots, their lineage folded neatly into the clan's tapestry. Generations later, the blood still runs, unspoken but potent. You follow one such imagined heir along a rugged path, the wind tugging at his plaid. He doesn't know he's carrying anything extraordinary. To him, his bloodline is just another Highland story told around a peat fire. But in the right light, his profile echoes those old carvings of knights. In the flicker of the hearth, you see the ghost of a cross on his chest. Scotland's landscape itself seems complicit. The lochs mirror the sky, black and bottomless, as if guarding whatever sank into them. The hills roll on like waves frozen in time, each hiding caves, ruins, or burial sites that might still hold traces of the Order. Walking through this land, you realize why the legends thrived here. Scotland doesn't just hold secrets, it breeds them. At night, in a drafty castle hall, the fire crackles and the whiskey warms your throat. A bard leans close, eyes glittering, and tells you that the Holy Grail itself was brought here, carried by Templars who fled France. Rosslyn Chapel, he insists, was built to guard it. You raise an eyebrow because, when someone has whiskey breath and that much confidence, you know you're either hearing a tall tale or the best bedtime story you will ever get. Still, the whispers linger. Some claim the Grail wasn't a cup at all, but a bloodline, that here in misty Scotland, the descendants of the sacred family continued in secret, shielded by the same knights who had guarded them in Jerusalem. The chapel, the carvings, the legends, they weren't about stone or chalices, but about genealogy hidden in plain sight. Historians still argue whether Rosslyn's symbols really encode anything beyond the artistic whims of stonemasons. But when you stand in that dim chapel, your fingers brushing the cold stone, it's hard not to feel the weight of stories pressing down on you. Maybe it's just the acoustics of the vaulted ceiling, Or maybe it's centuries of whispers refusing to fade. You step back out into the Scottish mist, your breath fogging the air. The chapel looms behind you, part church, part riddle. Somewhere in those hills, the bloodline may still wander, its heirs unaware of the centuries of legend braided into their veins. Scotland didn't just give the Templars a hiding place, it gave their myth a new home, one wrapped in fog, stone, and stubborn silence. The mist of Scotland fades, and you step into the firelit halls of Europe's secret societies. The air smells of melted wax, oak smoke, and old parchment. Hooded figures murmur in Latin or French, their voices echoing in vaulted chambers. This isn't a battlefield, nor a cloister's lodge. And here the whispers of the Templars take on new names, new rituals, and new disguises. The mainstream history anchors you first. By the 18th century, Freemasonry had spread across Europe, claiming descent from ancient builders, philosophers, and yes, sometimes from the Knights Templar themselves. Masonic rites in France and Germany openly invoked the Templars as spiritual ancestors, blending fact with mythology until no one could quite untangle the two. Step into a Masonic hall, and you might hear of Solomon's Temple, Templar martyrs, and secret bloodlines all in the same breath. It's like a conspiracy buffet. Everything served warm, none of it neatly labeled. The quirky tidbit. Some 18th century Freemasons actually staged mock trials of the Templars, complete with costumes and dramatic reenactments. Imagine a group of powdered wig aristocrats solemnly pretending to be knights accused of heresy, all while sipping brandy between lines. You want to laugh? But there is also something chilling about how they took the ashes of history and rekindled them into ritual. Historians still argue whether these societies were truly preserving ancient Templar traditions or simply borrowing their mystique for social and political clout. After all, secret handshakes and candlelit ceremonies look much more impressive when you can claim they redescended from crusader monks who defied kings and popes. But even if it was theater has power, especially when people believe it. You walk among the lodges, the candlelight flickering across painted symbols. Compasses, squares, twin pillars, and sometimes the Red Cross. In the corner a parchment is unrolled, listing genealogies not of kings, but of initiates, carefully recording who is inducted, sponsors whom, and occasionally who is descended from old stock. You pause, tracing the lines with your eyes. Are these merely records of fraternity membership or subtle nods to bloodlines meant to be hidden in plain sight? The deeper you go, the more the atmosphere thickens. In one hall, a man in silken robes speaks of the treasure that is not gold. In another, whispers circulate of blood kept pure through careful marriages, guarded by oaths, sworn not to Rome or crown, but to memory itself. You feel the weight of those oaths pressing like invisible chains, binding the descendants to a cause centuries old. And then the strangest detail surfaces. Some fringe accounts insist that the Freemasons, or at least certain branches, were not just symbolically linked to the Templars, but directly descended through families who had sheltered knights after 1307. In these tales, the lodges weren't inventions of the Enlightenment, they were continuations of hidden households, where fathers passed on rituals and names to sons, generation after generation. You imagine a family gathered in a candlelit kitchen, the father leaning close to whisper a story that is both bedtime tale and sacred oath. You carry their blood, never forget. Historians still argue whether the Freemasons' claims of Templar descent are legitimate history or 18th century marketing. Yet the persistence of the idea tells you something important. People wanted the bloodline to survive. They wanted heirs. They wanted continuity, because the idea of complete annihilation felt too neat, too unsatisfying. Legends don't die. Cleanly they seep. You pause in one lodge where the floor creaks under your boots, the smell of incense and old timber heavy in the air. Hooded figures pass a chalice from hand to hand. Is it wine? Is it a symbol? Or is it, in the minds of the most devoted, a ritual echo of something far older, a reminder of a cup once guarded in Jerusalem, a cup said to hold blood? The lodge doors open, spilling you into a cobbled street under a starlit sky. Europe hums with revolution. Now kings fall, republics rise, new nations are born, but under it all, these lodges persist, Their whispers of Templar lineage don't vanish. If anything, they grow louder, adapted to new times, new needs. A heritage both imagined and, perhaps, real. And as you walk away from the glow of the lodge windows, you can't help but wonder if even half of those whispered genealogies are true. Then the bloodline of the Templars didn't just survive it, adapted, cloaked itself in ritual, and threaded itself through the very societies that shaped the modern world.
You step away from Europe's flickering lodge lights and into the open sea again, sails cracking in the wind, salt spray stinging your face. The year has shifted forward, centuries rolling by, and now the whispers of the Templars aren't confined to stone chapels or smoky lodges. They've stretched across oceans, stitched into the sails of ships bound for the New World. The mainstream history first. Explorers like Christopher Columbus, Ferdinand Magellan, and Vasco da Gama all launched voyages under royal banners. But Portugal and Spain, the very kingdoms that sheltered Templar remnants, supplied much of the knowledge, funding, and navigational skill. The Order of Christ's Cross emblazoned Portuguese sails as they ventured across seas, carrying not only explorers but also the lingering shadow of Templar heritage. By the 16th century, the world map was bleeding red crosses. The quirky tidbit: there are claims half legend, half wishful thinking that Columbus himself may have been tied to the Order of Christ. His sails, painted with the Red Cross, have fueled speculation that his voyage wasn't just a royal expedition, but a continuation of Templar maritime tradition. Some fringe writers even suggest he carried secret orders to seek hidden lands where bloodlines had been secured centuries earlier. It's a wild idea, but you can't deny that stepping onto the deck of his ship, you feel the faint hum of something more than simple ambition. Historians still argue whether the age of exploration truly owed anything to Templar survival, or whether the connection is just a romantic overlay painted centuries later. Yet, when you trace the lines from Portugal's Order of Christ to the navigators it sponsored, the echoes are hard to ignore. You wander the deck of a caravel, ropes creaking, lanterns swaying. Below deck, sailors dice and curse, the air heavy with tar and sweat. Above, the stars blaze bright, constellations guiding them across waters that feel endless. Somewhere in the crew, perhaps, is a man with a name whispered in Europe, Cloister's, descendant of a knight burned in Paris, now sailing under a new flag but carrying the same blood. He doesn't boast of it, he barely knows it. But when storms rage and prayers are muttered, his presence feels oddly steady, as if his veins remember vows made long before his birth. Then there are the colonies. You set foot in the Americas, where European settlements sprout like stubborn weeds. Churches rise, crosses planted in foreign soil. In some corners, stories persist of settlers who claimed descent from ancient knights. In New France, in the dusty missions of Spain, in the wilds of Brazil, little hints appear, usually dismissed as drunken tales. Yet, when you hear the cadence of these stories repeated across oceans, it starts to sound less like coincidence and more like a family echoing its name in secret. A candlelit tavern in the Caribbean hums with such whispers. Pirates and privateers swap legends of hidden Templar maps, of treasure buried not in Europe but on distant islands. The treasure, they insist, wasn't gold, it was knowledge, perhaps even heirs. You smirk because pirates will turn anything into a treasure map. Still, when you picture a Templar descendant sipping rum under a false name, waiting for the right moment to surface, it doesn't feel entirely absurd. Historians still argue whether the red cross on those sails was anything more than symbolism, but walking the ports, the harbours, and the colonies, you see how symbols endure. A cross once feared in the Holy Land now flutters above new horizons. Bloodlines once hidden in cloisters now mingle with settlers and natives alike. If survival was the goal, then what better way than to scatter across continents, blending so thoroughly that no king could root them out again. You stand on a beach at night, waves hissing against the shore. The firelight of settlers flickers inland, while the stars blaze overhead, a reminder that voyages never truly end. Somewhere in those flickering fires, perhaps a child with the faintest trace of Templar blood is learning to walk. His mother hums a lullaby, her voice soft, unaware she carries a secret whispered across centuries. The ocean sighs, the sand cool beneath your feet, and you realize that the Templars didn't just survive, they expanded. Their crosses became sails, their heirs became explorers. Their whispers became part of a world too vast for Philip's decrees to ever touch.
The crash of Atlantic waves fades behind you as you step onto cobblestones again. But now the air is thick with revolution. Drums rattle in the distance, pamphlets scatter through the streets, and banners rise high above furious crowds. France is aflame once more, but this time, it isn't just knights and kings, it's entire societies tearing down thrones. And in the chaos of revolution, the whispers of Templar survival gain new fuel. The mainstream history first. By the late 18th century, France was a hotbed of Freemasonry. Lodges flourished in Paris and beyond, attracting nobles, intellectuals, and revolutionaries alike. Many of these lodges explicitly invoked Templar symbolism, red crosses, martyrdom, and the fall of 1307 woven into their rituals. For some revolutionaries, the memory of knights crushed by kings and popes became a rallying cry, a convenient historical analogy for their own fight against tyranny. You can almost hear them toasting in smoky taverns. To Demal, who burns forever. The quirky tidbit? On certain revolutionary anniversaries, groups of Freemasons staged mock Templar processions through the streets of Paris. Imagine a parade of men in white mantles and plumed hats, solemnly carrying relics, or at least what look like relics, through cheering crowds. Half street theater, half ritual, entirely dramatic. You can't help but think, if Instagram had existed in 1790, these guys would have gone viral. Historians still argue whether Freemasons really had any genealogical link to the Templars, or whether they simply adopted the imagery for its rebellious glamour. Yet the timing is suspicious. Just as France convulsed with revolution, the old Templar curse against kings seemed to resurface. Louis XVI, guillotined in 1793, was rumored by some to be the final fulfillment of de Maillet's prophecy. Justice delivered centuries late, but justice nonetheless. You smirk. Curses, it seems, have patience, but the whispers of bloodlines stir again. In the back rooms of revolutionary lodges, genealogical charts were unrolled, tracing not just noble ancestry, but peculiar branches that didn't match official records. Some names were marked with red ink, others with subtle crosses. Were these simply eccentric hobbyists, or caretakers of a lineage stretching back to knights who once defied kings? You slip into one such lodge. The candles sputter, the air smells of tallow and damp parchment. A man in powdered wig and apron gestures toward a scroll, his voice low but fervent. The heirs are among us. Guard them, and the light endures. His companions nod, solemn, though you can tell if they believe in sacred genealogy, or if they re-swept up in the theater of revolution. And outside, in the streets, chaos surges. Hear the shouts of the crowd, the clash of steel, the thud of the guillotine blade. Heads roll, blood stains the cobbles, but through it all, the lodges remain curiously intact. Too secretive to destroy, to networked, to silence. Perhaps within their walls, the descendants of hidden lines watched the collapse of monarchy with something between sorrow and grim satisfaction. The debate continues today. Historians still argue whether the French Revolution was influenced in any real way by Templar ideology, or whether it was simply Enlightenment rationalism dressed in medieval costume. Yet as you stand in the echo of those candlelit halls, you can't shake the feeling that old wounds were being avenged, old vows remembered. Night falls, and you wander past the dark outline of the Bastille, its stones heavy with memory. A woman sells pamphlets on the corner, her eyes sharp. A child chases a stray dog, laughter cutting through the gloom. Life pulses forward, even as regimes collapse. And somewhere, tucked into these living veins of the city, perhaps the Templar bloodline beats on, quieter now but enduring. The guillotine's blade gleams in the moonlight as you pass. Another king is dead, another regime toppled. And you hear the faintest echo of Jacques de Malay's voice in the night air. Centuries old, still whispering, justice comes. The streets of Paris fade into mist, and when you open your eyes again, you're standing in a world that hums with steam engines, ticking clocks, and the faint crackle of electricity. The 19th century has arrived, and with it comes a new obsession. Secret societies. If the French Revolution was a storm, this era is a warren of whispers, ciphers, and locked chests, where the supposed descendants of the Templars resurface in stranger, subtler ways. Mainstream history first. Europe in the 1800s was crawling with orders both old and newly invented. Freemasonry was at its peak, spawning offshoots like the Rosicrucians, the Carbonari, and endless Neo-Templar groups. In Paris, Bernard Dramond, Faber Palaprat, founded the Ordre du Temple in 1804, boldly claiming direct descent from the medieval knights. He even produced a document, the so-called L'Arminius Charter, that supposedly proved unbroken succession from Jacques de Malle himself. Many historians dismiss it as a forgery, but in candlelit halls, it carried the weight of gospel. The quirky tidbit. Faber Palaprat staged public ceremonies in full Templar regalia, with knights clanking around Paris like extras in a very earnest medieval cosplay. Crowds gathered to watch, some applauding, others chuckling, while officials muttered about stability. Imagine strolling down the boulevard and suddenly bumping into 20 men in white mantles, solemnly blessing a sword while a band plays nearby. It's a scene both grand and absurd. Historians still argue whether the L'Arminius Charter was genuine, or whether Faber Palaprat simply invented a lineage to give his order prestige. Yet for his followers, the debate didn't matter. They swore oaths, they wore the mantle, and they believed themselves protectors of an ancient bloodline. You slip into one of their gatherings. Gas lamps flicker, casting long shadows across the tiled floor. A man with a waxed mustache and stern eyes reads aloud names descendants. He insists who trace their veins back to Templar knights burned centuries before. You feel a chill. Perhaps he's bluffing, perhaps not. A young initiate trembles, kneels, and is dubbed into the order, his family name inscribed into their registers. Another drop in a lineage real or imagined. Meanwhile, Europe itself seethes with upheaval. Monarchies topple and return, empires rise and collapse, nationalism stirs like wildfire. And within all this turbulence, secret societies become havens for dreamers, plotters, and romantics. For some, the Templar mantle is a shield against modern chaos. For others, it's a political banner disguised as chivalry. A few even whisper of bloodlines hidden in rural villages, shepherded by discreet guardians until the right time comes to reveal them. You stroll into a library thick with dust, where scholars puzzle over medieval manuscripts. A professor taps a finger on a margin note, muttering, "This name it matches a family still in Auvergne." His colleague scoffs, but the seed is planted. Imagine how many such moments, small and quiet, fed the legend. Outside, the Industrial Revolution roars. Trains whistle, factories belch smoke, telegraphs click. And yet, even in this age of progress, candlelit rooms of self-styled knights whisper of vows older than coal, older than steam. It's almost comically half-expect one to pull out a pocket watch while swearing fealty to the Holy Sepulchre. But it's also moving. They're clinging to something timeless, a thread of meaning in a world spinning faster by the day. Historians still argue whether these 19th century Templar revivals were delusion, fraud, or fragments of real continuity. But as you watch the solemn faces of initiates in a Parisian lodge, you sense that the power wasn't in proving bloodlines, it was in believing them. Night stretches across Europe, lamps glowing along the boulevards. You wander through the fog, past carriages rattling over cobblestones. Somewhere behind curtained windows, men in mantles raise their cups and whisper the same vow uttered centuries ago. To guard the line, to guard the secret. Fog curls off the Seine, but when it lifts, you're no longer in 19th century Paris. Skyscrapers loom, neon lights flicker, and car horns blare welcome to the modern world, where the story of the Templars refuses to stay buried. Even here, among smartphones and satellite dishes, the whispers of a lost bloodline linger, traded not in cloisters but on message boards, documentaries, and late-night podcasts. Mainstream history first, the 20th century saw a massive revival of Templar fascination. Writers linked them to the Holy Grail, secret genealogies, and even conspiracies about hidden treasure vaults beneath Roslin Chapel in Scotland. Popular books in the 1980s and 90s later feeding? Hollywood blockbusters claimed the Templars preserved Jesus' descendants, safeguarding a bloodline through centuries of secrecy. Scholars roll their eyes at these tales, but millions of readers couldn't resist the thrill. The quirky tidbit. In the 1960s, a group in Spain claimed to crown a Templar Grand Master and staged processions through the streets of Madrid, robes, swords, and all like a medieval revival happening in the age of disco. You picture some poor tourist, polyester suit, and camera in hand, stumbling onto the parade and wondering if they'd accidentally time-traveled. Historians still argue whether there's even a shred of truth to the bloodline theory. Some dismiss it as pseudo-history, pointing out that evidence is scarce, too non-existent. Others, more cautiously, note that certain noble families in Europe did maintain suspiciously guarded genealogies, hinting at hidden branches stretching back to the 14th century. The debate hums on, unresolved, because certainty would rob the story of its very power. You scroll through a modern forum, usernames glowing in the dark. Threads argue passionately. One poster insists his family crest hides a Templar cross. Another claims DNA evidence points to Jerusalem roots. Most of it is shaky at best, but the sheer enthusiasm feels familiar. It's the same candlelit whispers, now flickering in pixels instead of wax. Then there's Roslin Chapel itself, its ornate carvings drawing tourists and treasure hunters alike. Standing beneath its vaulted ceiling, you trace the stonework with your eyes and almost believe the legends. Some say Templar scrolls are sealed beneath the floor. Others point to vines and angels etched into the walls as coded genealogies. You smile. It's half Indiana Jones, half Sunday school field trip, but the effect is real. Visitors leave convinced they've touched the edge of something vast and hidden. And so the bloodline persists not just in families, but in culture itself. From novels to video games, the Templar myth has slipped into our collective imagination. Whether or not the descendants truly walk among us, their story lives inside every retelling, every conspiracy theory, every candlelit documentary voiceover. You pause on a quiet street at night, far from the noise. The air is still, your footsteps soft. Somewhere behind a curtain, a family shares dinner, laughter rising like incense. You wonder, could one of them carry that secret bloodline, unaware of the weight in their veins? Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe the point is that the story itself has become the bloodline passed down, reshaped, but never extinguished. The legend of the lost heirs endures, not in dusty records, but in the imagination of anyone willing to believe that vows sworn centuries ago can ripple forward into your own time. And whether you scoff, smile, or secretly hope it's true, you've carried the story with you tonight, step by step, heartbeat by heartbeat. And now, with the journey at its close, let the pace ease. The drums of history quiet, the torches fade, and the roar of crowds dwindles to a hush. Imagine the world around you softening, streets emptying, waves slowing, even the stars dimming as if the whole universe exhales after carrying you through centuries. You've walked with knights beneath desert suns, sailed across storm-tossed seas, slipped into candlelit lodges, and drifted through revolutions. You've stood in places where history is certain, and in others where it dissolves into whispers and shadows. And yet, here at the end, there's no need to decide what was fact and what was legend. It's enough to know you've traced a thread that has never quite snapped, a story that insists on being retold. So now let yourself drift, not through time, but into rest. Picture yourself in a quiet cloister, stone walls cool against the night. A single candle flickering, its flame steady and calm. Outside the world sleeps, and inside your breath slows, steady as a tide. Every question can wait. Every mystery can rest. If somewhere out there, the descendants of those lost knights still live, their secret is safe for another night. And if the bloodline exists only in stories, then it has already found its immortality within you, and within the countless dreamers who will keep wondering. So breathe deep, let your eyes grow heavy, and let the centuries fold away like pages of a book closing. The nights fade, the torches dim, and silence settles over the ruins and the cities alike. All that remains is peace. The candlelight wavers in your imagination as you step back from the ruins and let yourself drift into the very beginning, the moment when the first men swore, oaths that would bind their lives and some whisper their descendants. It's around the year 1119, and you're in Jerusalem, though not the bustling tourist hub it is today. Instead, picture dust swirling through streets lined with stone houses, the call to prayer echoing from nearby mosques, merchants haggling in tongues you don't understand. And here, in a shadowy chamber within the royal palace, 9 knights kneel in silence. They are Frenchmen, all of them, worn from travel and battle, their cloaks ragged and armor dented. Yet something about this moment feels larger than them. You can almost smell the beeswax candles and hear the scrape of swords as they place the hilts to their foreheads. They vow to defend pilgrims on the road, protect the weak, surrender their lives to God. Pretty intense way to spend your gap year abroad, right? The man guiding them is Baldwin II, the King of Jerusalem. He offers them a corner of the palace built over what many believed was the Temple of Solomon. That detail matters because it wasn't just a cool real estate perk. It gave them their name, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. Thank goodness people shortened it to the Templars, because otherwise we'd still be wheezing halfway through their title. You watch their faces as the vows sink in. Poverty means no fancy jewelry, no private estates, no hoarding wealth. Chastity means no wives, no children.
Ow!
No late-night Tinder swipes, not even the medieval equivalent of carving initials into tree bark with your sweetheart. And obedience? Well, that one's the hardest of all. Obey your superiors without question, even if it means marching into certain death. Historians still argue whether those vows were meant sincerely or simply to give the order and aura of saintliness while they pursued more practical goals. The mainstream fact here? This small band of knights truly did form the nucleus of what became one of the most powerful organizations of the Middle Ages. By the mid-12th century, their order had thousands of members and fortresses stretching across continents. The quirky tidbit? Their first headquarters may have included stables built directly on top of ancient tunnels. Locals whispered that they spent their nights digging below, hunting for relics buried since biblical times. Maybe gold, maybe the Ark of the Covenant, maybe just really old pizza crust schwill, never know. But as you look closer at those kneeling figures, you sense that for some of them, the vow of chastity is not quite what it seems. Rumors later surfaced of hidden relationships, whispered encounters, even secret marriages that violated the official code. If just one of those stories held truth, then the possibility of a bloodline begins right here in the flicker of candlelight, with 9 men kneeling. And you wonder, did they know what they were starting? Did they imagine that centuries later, the Pope himself would dissolve their order and kings would brand them heretics? Or were they simply idealists, tired of watching pilgrims get slaughtered on the road to Jerusalem? The truth is, history rarely gives us a clean answer. It leaves us with fragments, and your mind does the stitching. As you stand in the chamber with them, at least in your imagination, you notice something else. The atmosphere is thick, almost theatrical. They're not just making personal promises, they're binding themselves into a brotherhood. It feels like a fraternity, but with fewer red solo cups and more existential danger. And though they wear simple tunics now, you can almost see the iconic white mantles with red crosses taking shape in your vision. Symbols so stark it still looks stylish. Today, minimalist branding before graphic designers were a thing. Can't help but smile at the irony. They swore poverty, yet their descendants, whether spiritual or literal, would become custodians of staggering wealth. They swore obedience, yet kings would later tremble at their independence. They swore chastity, yet the bloodline whispers insist some rule-bending affairs sowed seeds that endured through centuries. The vows were a cage, but cages sometimes have doors left just slightly ajar. The chamber quiets. A bell tolls somewhere in the city, the sound drifting in through narrow windows. You imagine the knights lifting their eyes, aware that their lives have just changed forever. They have no idea that you, centuries later, would be watching, trying to catch the thin thread that might tie their vows to a living pulse today. And maybe that's the most haunting part. You've seen secret societies form in modern times, people swearing oaths in basements or clubs. But this feels different. It isn't just loyalty to an idea. It's loyalty to something invisible, something that still hums beneath the ruins you walked through earlier. A current that doesn't stop when candles gutter out. You take a step back, leaving the knights in their chamber. Their whispers follow you, though, promising that this is only the beginning, that the vows you just witnessed will ripple outward, colliding with battles, betrayals, and yes, the stubborn rumor of a hidden bloodline that no vow could erase.
You descend the stone steps slowly, your hand brushing the damp wall, the air growing colder with each step. The knight's vows still ring in your ears, but here, beneath the Temple of Solomon, their true purpose takes shape. Picture it. The year is somewhere in the early 1120s, and those 9 knights more pious and allegedly penniless are spending long nights underground. Torches flicker, smoke curls against low ceilings, and the scrape of picks and shovels echoes through tunnels that had seen daylight since biblical times. The official story: they were guarding pilgrims on the roads, making sure weary travelers didn't get ambushed by bandits. A noble mission, no doubt, but here's the strange thing. For nearly a decade after their founding, there's almost no record of them actually doing that job. Instead, whispers suggest they were digging under the Temple Mount, digging for something that might explain how a tiny band of knights became so important so fast. Historians still argue whether these stories are fact or fiction. Some believe the knights were genuinely acting as escorts for pilgrims. Others think the escort duty was just a cover for something far more intriguing. Imagine being their neighbor every night. You hear muffled noises under the ground, like rats tunneling, except these rats carry swords and wear crosses. The mainstream fact here is straightforward. In 1867, a British explorer named Charles Wilson actually discovered tunnels and vaults beneath the Temple Mount that could have been accessible to the Templars. The quirky tidbit: local legends from Jerusalem long insisted that the knights carted away strange artifacts in the dead of night, including a golden table, scrolls of secret knowledge, and, if you believe the wilder tales, even the Ark of the Covenant itself. Nothing like some casual holy contraband to spice up your resumes. The air thickens as you picture them working in secrecy, dust clinging to their faces, sweat dripping despite the cool underground chill. You hear the grunt of men lifting stones, the hiss of breath when something unexpected appears in the dirt. Was it just rubble, or something carved, something too deliberate to ignore? And here's where the bloodline rumor starts whispering. Some traditions suggest they weren't merely hunting treasure, they were searching for genealogical records, ancient scrolls detailing royal bloodlines stretching back to King David. Imagine finding a piece of parchment claiming to chart the lineage of a figure revered not just as a king, but as the ancestor of Jesus himself. That kind of discovery could shift the power of Christendom overnight. Maybe it did. You stand in one of the chambers with the mat, least in your mind and watch as a knight kneels to lift a clay jar, brittle with age. Inside might be crumbling parchment, words inked by hands long gone. The men exchange glances, silent but charged. They know this isn't gold they're handling, it's something more volatile. Gold buys castles, bloodlines, crown kings. The thought unsettles you. If they uncovered proof of a sacred lineage, what would they do with it? Guard it? Hide it? Pass it secretly from generation to generation, weaving themselves into its fabric? Some conspiracy theorists claim that this was the moment the Templars stopped being just knights and became custodians of something eternal. Others roll their eyes and say they probably just found a few old coins and bragged about it at dinner. Either way, the silence of history around these years feels more suspicious than comforting. You notice how your breath fogs in the underground chill, though of course you're only imagining yourself there. It's a trick of the brain, the way stories can change the temperature of your body. A drop of water falls from the ceiling, landing in a pool that ripples across the stone floor. You think of pilgrims above shuffling through markets and praying at holy sites, completely unaware of the quiet storm building beneath their feet. One knight leans on his shovel, shoulders tense. Perhaps he's wary of secrets. Perhaps he worries that the vows they swore in candlelight are already cracking under the weight of what they've found. The Templars promised poverty, but if they're pulling priceless artifacts out of the ground, poverty suddenly feels negotiable. Promise chastity, but what if some relic hints at bloodlines that need preserving? Promised obedience, but what if God himself speaks through the relics, rewriting the rules? Historians still argue whether these supposed discoveries explain the Templars' meteoric rise in wealth and influence. Did hidden knowledge buy them leverage over kings and popes, or did they simply excel at managing money and running farms? Both answers sound plausible, yet one tastes much more dramatic. And let's be honest, if you're listening to this at midnight, you probably prefer the dramatic version. You climb further into the imagined tunnel, the air heavy with secrets. Your hand brushes against carvings on the wall, faint and indecipherable. but you swear they look like interwoven vines patterns that will show up centuries later in places like Roslyn Chapel. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe the Templars carried their underground discoveries into stonework that still whispers to anyone patient enough to listen. Above you, the city of Jerusalem bustles on, but down here, the hum of pickaxes and the hush of voices carve a different narrative. You, Dan T., know whether to laugh at the idea of armored knights moonlighting as archaeologists, or to shiver at the thought of them stumbling upon something that could tilt the scales of faith, power, and family ties. As you climb back toward the surface, the torches fading behind you, one thought sticks. Treasure can be spent, relics can be stolen, but a bloodline niff. That's what they found evidence of threads through the centuries, invisible yet unbreakable. And once you've uncovered that thread, how do you ever let it go?
The air above ground feels lighter now, but you can't shake the memory of those nights in the tunnels, crouched over jars and parchments that may have whispered of blood. You step into the sunlight of 12th century Jerusalem, and it seems brighter than it should be. It's almost theatrical, like the world itself knows a secret is being born. The Templars, still only a handful of men, return to their quarters in the palace, dusty and wide-eyed. Their leader, Hugi Stepaeans, says little, but his silence hums louder than words. They have found something, or at least, they believe they have. And this is where the whispers begin, of a hidden liaison, a meeting of flesh and spirit that plants the seed of a bloodline. The mainstream history is simple. The Templars were granted official recognition in 1129 at the Council of Troia, where the Church gave them legitimacy and support. But tucked into that timeline are quieter, less documented rumors. Some claim that in the years between their founding and their papal blessing, they had already forged bonds that tied them not just to kings, but to something more sacred. You picture a moonlit courtyard. Knight slips away from his brothers, the rules of chastity heavy in his chest, but the pull of something else heavier still. He meets a woman cloaked in shadows, perhaps noble, perhaps local, perhaps someone with lineage far older than both of them. Their words are hushed, but their union is not about lust or rebellion. It's about preservation. The idea that through blood, a holy thread can be safeguarded, strengthened, and passed on. Is this truth or just legend? Historians still argue whether the idea of a Templar bloodline was propaganda invented centuries later to romanticize the order. But as you stand in the imagined courtyard, the night wind brushing against your face, it feels oddly plausible. After all, rules are written by men, but life has a way of slipping through cracks. The quirky tidbit here: the Templars' official rulebook, written under the guidance of Bernard of Clairvaux, had such peculiar details that you almost laugh at the idea of them leading double lives. For instance, they were forbidden from eating meat more than 3 times a week. 3. As if keeping track of steak night was the key to holiness. Yet the same men could be digging under the Temple Mount for divine secrets and sneaking away into moonlight for clandestine meetings. You trace the thought further. What if one of those knights fathered a child with a woman tied, however tenuously, to the line of David? The implications would be explosive, an unbroken chain connecting Christ's lineage to the guardian sworn to protect his legacy. Suddenly, their vow of chastity doesn't look like a barrier but a shield officially. They had no children, so unofficially any child born of them would slip under history's radar. Your footsteps take you through the streets of Jerusalem, crowded and fragrant with spices, smoke, and sweat. Merchants shout over figs and dates, pilgrims shuffle with wide-eyed awe, and in the midst of it all, a knight in a simple tunic disappears into a side alley. No one notices. Why would they? He is just another weary soldier. And yet the moment he vanishes into that alley, history itself tilts a fraction. You wonder what it would feel like, carrying a secret like that. Knowing that you had sired not just a child, but a legacy that could redraw the world map. Every battle you fight, every coin you lend, every prayer you whisper, all doubles as protection for that hidden thread of blood. Perhaps that's why their order grew so quickly. why wealth and power seemed to flow toward them as though magnetized. Maybe it wasn't just banking genius. Maybe it was leveraged, because if you're guarding a bloodline that could append the church, even kings have to treat you carefully. And still, the debate rages. Was there ever such a child? Or was the entire idea of Templar bloodlines a myth cooked up by Renaissance romantics and modern novelists? You smirk to yourself, because whether true or not, the story has already lodged itself in your head like a splinter. Try pulling it out. It won't come easy. As you leave the courtyard and wander past the looming walls of the city, you hear faint church bells. The sound is soft, almost drowned out by the clamor of merchants, but it carries weight. The knights, kneeling in candlelight, may not have imagined themselves as fathers of dynasties, yet destiny rarely asks permission. And so, somewhere between dusty vows and moonlit whispers, the bloodline is said to have drawn its first breath. Maybe it's myth, maybe it's memory. But as you glance back at the silhouette of Jerusalem's walls, you know one thing: the story has only just begun to tangle itself around you. You trudge forward along a dirt path, the sun pressing hot against your shoulders, and suddenly the air is thick with the smell of smoke. Battlefields stretch before you, not the grand cinematic clashes you see in movies, but messy, dusty sprawls of confusion. Men shouting in half a dozen languages, banners whipping in the wind, and horses rearing as arrows rain down. You're walking through the Crusades now. The Templars are right in the middle of it, steel against steel, faith against faith. The mainstream history here is solid. The Templars fought in nearly every major battle of the Crusades. From the siege of Ascalon to the disastrous fall of Acre, they earned a reputation for bravery, sometimes bordering on suicidal. You imagine a thin line of knights holding their ground against waves of charging cavalry. Their white mantles smeared with blood and dust, refusing to retreat, even when outnumbered. They weren't superheroes. Of course, they lost battles, too often spectacularly. But their willingness to fight to the last man gave them a reputation as both holy warriors and, frankly, terrifying lunatics. And yet, beneath the clang of swords, another legacy was being shaped. Picture the survivors limping away from battlefields, their bodies battered, but their minds carrying something unseen. Not just trauma, though plenty of that, but knowledge, whispers, perhaps even fragments of relics, salvaged from ruined cities. A piece of cloth, a scrap of parchment, a rumor exchanged between prisoners. You can almost hear it, a quiet current flowing beneath the roar of war. The idea that blood, not just steel, was the real treasure. Historians still argue whether the Templars' victories were due to divine favor, clever tactics, or simply stubbornness that made retreat impossible. But the legends say their endurance was fueled by something greater, that they fought not merely for Jerusalem, but for the survival of a lineage entrusted to them. Imagine a knight falling on the battlefield, his last thoughts not of heaven but of a child somewhere in hiding, carrying forward the thread of his order's true mission. The quirky tidbit: despite their image as grim-faced warriors, the Templars actually had some strict dining etiquette, even during campaigns. Chronicles mention how they sat in silence at meals, two to a bowl, one man responsible for cutting the bread while the other poured the wine. Even on dusty fields, they clung to rituals of order and restraint. You can almost picture it: two armored men sitting on the ground, quietly spooning stew while arrows whistle overhead. Imagine the Yelp review. Ambiance could be better. Food was lukewarm. Service was efficient. The battles themselves are brutal, though you glide over them lightly, more ghost than participant. Dust blinds your eyes, your ears ring from the clamor, and you stumble through the chaos until you find yourself in the aftermath. Corpses lie twisted in the dirt, banners torn, and yet among the wreckage the Templars gather. They murmur prayers, but their eyes shift to one another with unspoken questions. Who survived? Who carried the lineage forward? You kneel beside a discarded shield, its red cross chipped and faded, and you feel how fragile the order really is. War can wipe out entire units in a heartbeat. The bloodline, if it existed, needed to be carefully hidden, passed not through battle, but through secrecy. Maybe that's why their presence felt doubled warriors on the field, guardians in the shadows. As you rise, the wind shifts, carrying the acrid smell of smoke and charred wood. Villages and cities burned in the wake of both crusaders and their enemies. Innocent lives crushed between empires. The Templars were no saints. They were products of their brutal age. And yet, in this chaos, the myth of their other mission only grows stronger. When the world is falling apart, people cling to the idea of something indestructible, something hidden that survives the flames. You glance toward the horizon, where the silhouettes of castles dot the hills. The Templars built them like chess pieces across the land-fortified outposts, meant not just for defense but also for storage. Treasure, documents, maybe even living heirs tucked away behind stone walls. A fortress can keep out enemies, but it can also hide what you don't want the world to see. Historians still argue whether these fortresses were simply military necessities, or whether they doubled as vaults for the Order's deepest secrets. The line between strategy and conspiracy blurs here. And you, walking through the dust of war, can't help but think. If you had to preserve a fragile thread of blood across centuries, wouldn't you tuck it into the safest walls you could build? The battlefield fades, leaving you standing on a hill at dusk. Below, the fires burn low, smoke curling into the sky like incense. The Templars ride back to their camps, their mantles ragged, but their symbols unbroken. And somewhere, behind their grim silence, the inheritance of blood and belief survives, stubborn, waiting for the world to catch up. The crackle of fire greets you as you step into the shadow of Notre Dame. The square is crowded, a sea of faces pressed close, their breath steaming in the cold air. At the center, two figures stand bound, two tall wooden stakes. Their white mantles are gone, their hair matted, their faces gaunt from months of captivity. The smell of pitch clings to the air, sharp and acrid. The people murmur half fearful, half eager as flames lick upward, and history holds its breath. The mainstream fact here is undeniable. In 1314, Jacques de Maule, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, was burned alive on an island in the Seine. Beside him, Geoffrey de Charny met the same fate. But it's not the fire itself that immortalized them, it was Malay's final words. With smoke curling into the Paris sky, he supposedly cursed both Pope Clement V and King Philip IV, summoning them to divine judgment within the year. And eerily enough, both men did die within 12 months. You shift uneasily, wondering if curses have expiration dates, or if they linger like ash long after the fire goes out. The quirky tidbit? Eyewitness accounts describe Malay standing with remarkable composure as the flames consumed him, shouting to God for justice. Some even say his voice carried across the river, defying both king and pope with eerie calm. It's the sort of cinematic moment Hollywood couldn't script better. Imagine the director yelling, "More drama," Mal replying, "Don't worry, I've got this." Historians still argue whether Malay truly spoke. The famous curse, or whether it was added later to dramatize his martyrdom. After all, medieval chroniclers loved nothing more than turning executions into morality plays. But whether or not the words were real, the legend stuck. And in sticking, it gave the Templars a kind of immortality no fire could erase. You linger at the edge of the crowd, feeling the heat on your face, the roar of the fire pressing against your ears. The smell of burning wood mixes with the stench of singed cloth and hair. You want to turn away, but the sight holds you, the image of power collapsing into ash, yet leaving behind something far more enduring. Myth. And here's where the bloodline whispers creep in again. Some stories claim that Malay's defiance wasn't only spiritual. For his arrest, he may have arranged for the Order's deepest secrets to pass into safe hands. Did he know that Templar heirs were already hidden, guarded in castles or cloisters far from Philip's reach? Did his calm in the flames come not from despair, but from certainty that the bloodline was safe? The fire blazes higher, sparks spiraling into the twilight sky. The crowd murmurs prayers, curses, or nothing at all, each face lit in flickering orange. And as Malay's body slumps, the legend ignites brighter than the flames. You can feel it in the air. This is not an ending. This is a transformation, a seed planted in ash. Later, when the smoke clears and the crowd disperses, you walk the embers. The stakes still smolder, the ground scorched black. You crouch, brushing the ash with your fingers, and you realize something. Executions are supposed to erase movements, silence leaders, and terrify followers. But here, the opposite happened. The curse, the composure, the unanswered questions, they fed the fire of imagination. And like wood doesn't burn out, whispers of survivors. grow louder in the years that follow. Some say the Templars fled to Scotland, sheltered by nobles who owed them favors. Others speak of ships bound for Portugal, where kings welcomed their expertise. A few claim the bloodline itself, those hidden heirs, was smuggled out under the guise of servants or pilgrims. Their identities carefully disguised. You hear these rumors like echoes carried on the wind, each one impossible to prove, but impossible to kill. Historians still argue whether the fall of the Templars truly ended their order, or merely scattered it into fragments that continued under different names. Some point to the Knights Hospitaller, others to shadowy Masonic lodges centuries later. But walking these smoldering stones, you sense that something more intimate was preserved, not an institution, but a thread of living lineage protected as fiercely as any holy relic. The Seine rolls on beside you, its dark water reflecting the last glow of fire. Somewhere downstream, perhaps ships already carry survivors and secrets into the night. Paris sleeps uneasily. The king congratulates himself in his palace, but the streets hum with rumor. The Templars are gone, yet not gone. Burned, yet unburnable. And you, still standing in the square, the ash drifting like snow around you, realize you've just witnessed the birth of a ghost. Not a haunting specter, but a ghost story so enduring it still flickers centuries later. Whispered in conspiracies, scrawled in half-baked novels, and woven into bloodlines that may or may not exist. The flames of Paris fade behind you, but the story doesn't end in ash. You follow whispers carried across the sea, rumors that slip from taverns and monasteries alike. Not all Templars were destroyed. Some fled westward, finding safety under foreign crowns. And here in Portugal and Spain, the bloodline might have stretched out its hidden fingers. The mainstream history comes first. In Portugal, King Denis cleverly rebranded the outlawed order. Instead of persecuting them, he created the Order of Christ in 1319, essentially giving the Templars new uniforms and a fresh coat of paint. Same knights, same castles, but now officially sanctioned under a different name. It's like watching a band break up and then reform under a new label. 2 weeks later, same drummer, new tour posters. In Spain, similar transitions took place, with Templar properties absorbed into other knightly orders. But here is where it gets interesting. Portugal didn't. T just preserved the knights. It gave them a springboard into the age of exploration. Centuries later, Prince Henry the Navigator would use the Order of Christ resources to fund voyages down the African coast, voyages that set the stage for global empires. That iconic red cross you've seen on the sails of Portuguese ships, that was the Templar cross, resurrected and fluttering proudly across oceans. You realize, stepping onto a sunlit Iberian dock, that the order never really died, just changed addresses. The quirky tidbit? There are tales of Templar ships slipping into Portuguese harbors, their sails lowered under cover of night, carrying not only treasure but families, wives, children, perhaps heirs that were never supposed to exist. Locals claimed strangers with foreign accents appeared in coastal villages, living quietly, marrying into local lineages, and disappearing from official record. Imagine trying to track that in medieval paperwork. If even your local bakery loses receipts sometimes, how do you expect a 14th century scribe to keep up with fugitive knights and secret kids? Historians still argue whether the Templars really integrated smoothly into Iberian orders, or whether their remnants operated in parallel, keeping their own oaths alive. Some argue that the Order of Christ was simply a political smokescreen, a way to shield the Templars' assets without drawing papal wrath. Others suggest a deeper conspiracy that Portugal became the safe house for their hidden bloodlines. A place far enough from Paris's shadow, yet powerful enough to protect what mattered most. You wander through a Portuguese fortress, its walls sun-bleached and sturdy. The air tastes of salt, the sea crashing against cliffs below. On one wall, carved into the stone, you spot faint symbols, not quite Christian, not quite pagan, something in between. Were these mere decorations, or coded markers left for those who knew how to read them? You run your fingers over the grooves, the stone warm under the sun, and you can almost feel the weight of secrets pressed into every line. At night, you drift into a Spanish monastery. The monks chant low, their voices weaving through candlelit halls. But in a side cloister, away from the prayers, you overhear quiet conversations. Names whispered, lineages traced, marriages arranged, not for politics, but for preservation. If the bloodline was here, it wasn't celebrated, it was hidden, carefully woven into the fabric of noble families. Maybe that quiet young squire you pass isn't just a servant of the monastery. Maybe he carries a name too dangerous to speak aloud. The sea calls again. You stand at the harbor watching ships ready for voyages. The air smells of tar, rope, and fish. Sailors haul cargo, children chase gulls, and in the distance the horizon gleams. Somewhere on those decks, perhaps, ride descendants of Templars, blending into the crews that would one day redraw the map of the world. If you've ever suspected that the roots of European exploration carried a hidden agenda, you're standing at the shoreline of that suspicion. Historians still argue whether the Iberian survival was practical politics or deliberate protection of sacred knowledge and blood. But as you gaze across the waves, you feel the possibility that the bloodline didn't just survive, it sailed, spreading into new lands under the Red Cross that once terrified kings. And so, as night falls over Iberia, the story doesn't fade into obscurity. It stretches outward, sails billowing, oars churning, airs and secrets tucked into the folds of history. The order burned in France, but here, under southern stars, it learned how to breathe again.